So hi, I'm Matt, and today we're going to talk about the Washington, D.C. Statehood movement, the history behind it, and the reasons for why D.C. statehood matters. So currently, because Washington, D.C. isn't a state, the city lacks much representation in Congress. We currently have no representation at all in the Senate. Our delegate to the House doesn't have the power to vote on final passage of legislation and can only serve on committees. Congress can meddle in the city's local laws and budget, and we don't have a say in amending the Constitution of the U.S. The reason the founders created D.C., the spark for it, is that initially Congress met in the 50 states, or the 13 states at the time, and most of the time they were meeting in Philadelphia. But in 1783, a riot of Revolutionary War veterans who had not been paid threatened to harm Congress. And Congress was really afraid that they could be attacked. And so they went to the Pennsylvania Executive Council, which met in the same building, and asked if Pennsylvania could use the state militia to protect it. And Pennsylvania said no, because they didn't want to get involved in a politically sensitive issue. So at that point, Congress had to flee the city, and they decided that it would be too risky in the future to have the capital city be in a state, because the state would have too much influence over the federal government and the law enforcement protecting the federal government. So in the Constitution, they put a provision that says Congress should have power to exercise exclusive legislation over the district comprising the seat of government, and that the district has to be fewer than 10 miles square. So the way this worked is that the states of Maryland and Virginia each donated land to form the territory of Columbia. So it was originally a specific piece on the Potomac River that was chosen by George Washington to include the cities of Georgetown, Maryland, and Alexandria, Virginia that already existed. And initially, when they were framing the Constitution, James Madison wrote in Federalist Paper 43 that we shouldn't be worried about how this might affect representation for people living there, because he was sure that the land chosen would be chosen with the consent of the people living there. But then when they actually created the district, the residents weren't asked, and so they lost representation by losing their statehood against their will. And almost immediately after this happened in 1800, people started petitioning Congress, they didn't have representatives in it, to give them back representation. So in 1847, the Congress actually did give back the part of the district that had belonged to Virginia, and this was done for two main reasons. Firstly, the Virginia half of the district wasn't really being used for any federal buildings, and no federal infrastructure was there. And secondly, Virginia wanted to keep the slave trade at a time when it was going to be banned in the district, and so this allowed them to keep it after sale of slaves was banned elsewhere. At the time the district was created, it had just 8,000 residents, and most of it was completely rural, some of which still exists in forested pockets like Rock Creek Park. But after the abolition of slavery in 1865, DC's population grew very fast. So between 1860 and 1870, it grew 75% and passed 100,000 people. So mostly because of free slaves moving into the district. And within a few decades, DC became a mostly urban metropolis. So in 1871, Congress abolished the previously existing counties and cities that had existed within the federal district and made it all one city called Washington. So by now, DC has more than 700,000 people, which is larger than the states of Vermont and Wyoming, and it's still growing at a rate faster than any of the 50 states. So DC's push for political equality really took off around the Civil Rights era, when the first major thing that happened is in 1961, DC was granted electoral votes for president, but it was capped at the number that the least populous state has. So currently that's not a big deal because DC's population only qualifies it for 3 votes. But if DC's population were ever to rise to where it would get 4 or 5, it would still only have 3 because Wyoming has 3. In 1971, Congress allowed DC to send a non-voting delegate to the House who can serve on committees but not vote on the final passage of bills. And the reason that this is possible is because the Constitution allows the House of Representatives to define its own procedures. And voting on committees is considered a procedural thing, whereas voting for final passage of bills on the floor of the House is not. So this was as far as Congress could go through normal legislation to give DC representation. And then in 1973, Congress finally gave DC an elected mayor and council, whereas before then the mayor had been appointed by the president, and most of the councilors had also been politically appointed. But Congress can still overturn the city's laws or meddle in its laws and budget. So one of the first big, or one last thing that happened that they attempted was the DC Voting Rights Amendment in the 1970s, which said that for purposes of congressional representation and voting for president, DC would be treated as if it was a state. But it never got enough votes enough ratifications to actually pass. So you can see the states here that ratified it in white, and the states that didn't are in blue. And it ended up being 22 ratifications short of the 3/4 required to pass. And the biggest, or one of the big problems with this amendment is even though it solved the voting rights side of DC's political rights problem, it didn't do anything about home rule. And so the city could still have all of its local affairs turned over by Congress. And so currently, the way this works is that any law passed by the DC Council and signed by the mayor has to get sent to Congress, where it sits there for a 30 or 60-day waiting period, depending on the type of the law, and only days when Congress is in session are counted towards the 60-day waiting period. So there have been cases where the DC Council will pass a law in like July, and it doesn't take effect until next year because Congress doesn't meet enough. And even after that review period, Congress can overturn any DC laws that it wants. And likewise, the DC budget has to get submitted to Congress where they can change it if they want to. So one of the things Congress does with that is that frequently, Congress will block DC laws from being funded rather than repealing them explicitly, try to keep up the appearance of allowing local rule. And some policy examples from that are in the 1990s, Congress blocked DC from expanding healthcare benefits to same-sex couples, so you couldn't qualify a same-sex spouse for healthcare benefits. And they blocked a needle exchange program for about a decade that DC wanted to use to fight the AIDS epidemic. Congress also currently blocks DC from using any local taxes to fund abortion services through Medicaid, which is a decision that all of the other states get to have. And so the reason for statehood is that it would give DC full representation in Congress, a say in amending the Constitution, and full votes for president, and it would prevent Congress from interfering in state policy. Currently, it has a population larger than 2 of the states, and it's growing faster than any of them, so it's expected to rise the number that it's larger than. And this would be immediate, so the incremental policies of the past that we talked about would no longer be necessary. The current statehood bill in Congress is H.R. 51, that would take the residential parts of the city and turn those into a new state while leaving the constitutionally mandated federal district under federal control or congressional control. So the founders' idea of a separate capital would still be in existence, but the people elsewhere would have representation. And this is the plan that DC wants to use to pass the bill. So the steps that other states have used to get statehood are once you pass a population of 60,000, you can draft a proposed constitution for the new state, which I have a copy of here. We held our statehood constitutional convention in the 1980s. So we drafted this constitution, then we have voters approve the idea in a referendum. That referendum occurred in 2016 when 86% of DC residents voted in favor of statehood. Then you elect a shadow delegation, which consists of a shadow representative and 2 shadow senators who go to Congress to basically be your advocates for statehood. And they don't have any real voting powers in Congress, but they try to meet with other members and persuade them to support the statehood bill. So the next two steps that we haven't done yet are have Congress pass a bill creating the new state and have the president sign that bill. We're currently on the congressional step, and just last month, the bill got its first hearing in the House of Representatives in several decades. So it's a major accomplishment in moving these steps along. Some of the common opposition arguments against DC statehood are that it might be unconstitutional because the land was given by Maryland to be specifically for the purposes of a federal district. But of course, there isn't really a clear argument in the Constitution that Maryland has any reversionary interest in continuing to own the land. So some people say, oh, you can't do this because it's still Maryland's land in a sense. But in reality, when Maryland gave the land to the federal district, they said it would be the federal district, or it would belong to Congress permanently, and Congress can do what it wants with it. Then another argument you'll hear often is that the new state would be able to influence Congress too much, but I don't think that's necessarily a big concern, because like other countries have things like this, where Berlin is its own state, and Brasilia is its own province in Brazil, and none of them actually like threatened to block Congress from meeting or anything. The way it worked in the 1800s, where you refused to protect Congress, is long gone, and a lot of DC's economy is tied to Congress. So the idea that DC would try to block Congress from working is not very persuasive. And lastly, you'll hear people say that DC is just too small to be a state geographically, but I don't think geography should matter nearly as much as population. And as we've said, we're growing faster than any of the states that already exist. So one of the main counter proposals made against DC statehood is that instead of statehood, you should just give the land back to Maryland. But a couple issues with this are that polls show the majority of Marylanders support it. And in fact, a new one came out very recently with that. Most of Maryland's congressional delegation says that they support statehood instead. And unlike Virginia, where it was still within one generation of having been Virginia's land when they gave it back, it's now been more than 200 years since what's now DC was part of Maryland. And the identities of the two jurisdictions have completely diverged, where if DC were to rejoin Maryland now, it would be, I believe, the largest city in Maryland, and it would completely change the political landscape there in ways that most Marylanders don't want. And lastly, the interests of both sides politically would be diluted, and so a lot of Maryland would oppose it based on the idea that if they let DC rejoin, their own senators wouldn't listen to them as much. And one of the key things that we need people to do is for people outside Washington, D.C. to care about this, because the people from outside D.C. are the ones who still have representatives and senators who they can write to find out about it. And so one of the things we think people should ask is whether or not their representatives support statehood. And if you want to find that out, you can go to the Students for DC Statehood website, where we have a page where it lists all the members who are currently sponsoring H.R. 51. And one other thing you can do to get involved is on November 5th this year, we'll be having our second annual letter writing campaign at the Shaw Library in DC. We'll be writing letters to many of the members of Congress. So that's all I have. Would you like to say anything? All right. So we'll also be doing a lobby day in April. We'll have people go up to Capitol Hill and try to lobby members of Congress to support DC statehood. And I'll give you more information about that some other time. So if you have any questions. All right, then.
So Congress can basically just, if they wanted to, they could just completely overrun and take away DC's local government, right?
That's correct. Only states in the U.S. Constitution have the power or have protected legal rights. Congress can revoke the self-government of any of the territories. And in fact, early in DC's history, there were times when some of the separate cities in the federal district had their own elected governments, and they were all repealed in 1871 when it was replaced with a government appointed directly by the president.
And I read an interesting example. couple weeks ago about Mexico City, which Mexico itself, its constitution was kind of outlined based on our own constitution, and they had their own federal district, and actually just a couple years ago, they decided to give their capital city a form of statehood. They're not 100% equal in my understanding, but they have addressed many of the representation and autonomy arguments that we currently still have. So the fact that they followed our lead and then already fixed that problem, I think we're a little behind on that. Yeah.
Yeah, the United States is, as far as I know, the only country on earth where the citizens of the capital city don't have the same rights as the rest of the residents of the country. So DC is one of the parts of the US that is most directly controlled by the federal government and is subject to all federal taxes, and yet does not have representation in Congress. So we're the most directly controlled by it with the least say in it, which is a really terrible example of taxation without representation.
I would love to hear more about your experience in high school, what they taught you about it.
Yeah, so we learned about all of DC's history, including gentrification, everything. So we had a lot of different perspectives on the case, and we talked about full statehood. We talked about creating just a federal district, so taking out just the capital, all the big places. We talked about amending the Constitution, because some people feel that that is what has to be done in order to make a change. And really, we just talked about the ongoing arguments of how it's done, not necessarily they didn't want to influence our decisions one way or another. But I was wondering, actually, so you mentioned that a counter argument is that DC would have too much influence in Congress, but you mentioned blocking it. But do you think also it would create an imbalance of liberal and conservative viewpoints?
Not necessarily. One of the arguments against DC statehood that comes up occasionally is that DC is so liberal that it would just elect Democrats to Congress every time, and that that would be unfair to the Republicans somehow. But back when Alaska and Hawaii were created as states, there was a belief that Hawaii would be the most solidly Republican state in the Union, and that Alaska would be the most solidly Democratic state in the Union, or one of the most solidly Democratic states. But since then, it's completely reversed. Alaska is now a super red state, and Hawaii is a solidly Democratic state. And so you can't actually tell how a state is going to vote in the future based on how it votes now.
Do you think that they should also add another state in at the same time, so there's an even number?
I don't think it would be necessary. That's something Congress could choose to do if it wanted to. But there have been times when states have been created without having another state at the same time. And so it's not really a matter of, can you keep the number of Democrats and Republicans in Congress as even as possible? It should just be a matter of, is every American represented? And so I don't think it should actually be necessary to add a new state as a compromise with DC.
And how do you think we can get more conservatives on board? What messaging do you think works best when talking with more conservative individuals?
Well, conservatives should believe in democracy the same way that everybody else does. And one of the things that Republicans often talk about in Congress is the importance of states' rights and allowing local governments to have as much say as possible in their local issues. And they want the federal government to shrink. But for some reason, not all of them would support DC statehood. And so they really should support it, if nothing else, as a states' rights issue, where Thomas Jefferson, when the country was founded, believed that the United States would just be a really broad swath of local governments where all Americans could get involved in their government and could run for office and make changes. And it hasn't worked out that way, because DC and the other territories don't have representation there, and they can't control their local budget and their local issues. So budget autonomy, local laws, all of which can be interfered in with the federal government where you have no say. And this is exactly what the founders wanted to avoid, and I think conservatives should agree with that.
And I know you're from DC. How do you think that we can get people to care about this around the country who aren't here, who aren't affected by it?
I really think it's what you're saying. I think you just need to educate people. I don't think a lot of people understand the problem. They just assume that people can
Do you think they think DC is already a state or a part of a state or nobody lives here?
I don't know. I hear like mixed things, honestly. Like some people know and are educated, and some people just think it's like where the capital is and where the president lives, and they don't understand that there are people living here and it's not just the government. So that's another thing.
So one thing I would just want to mention is we have these copies of the DC Constitution. And I believe you can probably find these online if you're interested to learn like what the city government or what the state's government would look like if we were to get full representation. So if you want one, feel free to take it. So if you're interested in getting involved, you can go to the Students for DC Statehood website online or find our social media pages, and we'll talk about events. You can find out when which members of Congress are supporting it and whether your member does. And it'll give you a good base to get started with. The simplest thing you can do is just write a letter to your member of Congress asking them to support HR 51 because we just had that hearing in the House and we think there's a good chance we can pass it in the House this year. And then it's going to be a matter of getting it passed in the Senate and getting the president's signature. We think we're making really good progress. So just find out whether your member supports it and try to get involved.